Hi, Mark here again. Now, obviously we're standing in front of my Lamborghini here, and I know a lot of you out there maybe have a car like this or wonder what it is like for maintenance when you own a car like this. And really it boils down to the question ultimately, do you maintain your own supercar or do you take it to a mechanic that knows what he's doing? Now, I know a lot of people locally here that a lot of guys take it upon themselves to perform their own maintenance. I also know a lot of people that won't touch their car other than the key and they will take their car in. So there's many reasons why you would and would not perform your own maintenance on a car like this. On my Lamborghini, I have chosen to do some minor maintenance. That's something that, I've done the research, and I believe truly if you are well studied and are fairly mechanical by nature, why not do some of your own maintenance? There are goods and bads to that, however. Now, the good side to performing your own maintenance, of course, on a car like this is number one, cost savings. For some people, they say, well, you're driving a supercar, why are you trying to save a nickel and dime? Yeah, that's kind of a given. However, people did not get rich by spending money, they got rich by saving money. So that's one way to save some money, is performing some of your own maintenance. Performing your own maintenance really comes down to what is your threshold? How much are you willing to tolerate as far as risk tolerance? So it really boils down to what are my capabilities, where are my limitations, and even what kind of tools do you need? Am I limited even by the equipment or the tools needed to perform that work? The plus side in performing your own maintenance, of course, is when you do your own maintenance, you're taking the extra time. A lot of times, there's always a concern about when you take your car to the shop, can I trust that mechanic? Can I trust that shop? I've experienced enough in the past where a poor mechanic can really wreak havoc on your car, and that's the last thing you want. So when you take your own car into the shop under your own knife, what you're doing actually is ensuring that, not only is the maintenance done, but it's done correctly, and you're going to take the extra time to look at those details. Looking at all the little intricate details, there's typically little cleaning, you'll do a little polishing. There's areas that you wouldn't normally get to. For example, if you're doing some engine work, you might have a bunch of the plastics taken off. And those are things that the mechanics generally would never do. It's not something you're not paying them. They got a book dollar amount that is going to be charged for your car for doing a specific task. Well, in that book dollar amount, they're only getting paid X amount of dollars as a mechanic. They're, in a lot of cases, and I can't say everybody, a lot of cases, they're not going to touch anything else. There's a bunch of crusty on the space frame there, they're not going to touch that. They don't care. They're fixing the part that's broken, or they're doing their maintenance, and that's where they're going to close the door, shut the door, move on. You're going to have parts in the car that never get addressed. The flip side, however, so you choose to do maintenance that you're not necessarily capable of, and you're going to tackle it, there's risks. There's risks on, for example, this Lamborghini, and I'll show you, and here's maybe something you didn't know. When you jack the front end of the car up, pretty routine task for most vehicles. You want to change a tire, you're doing a brake job or something like that. That in itself isn't that much of a rocket science. But there's little things with a car like this. If you do not jack both corners of the front up at the same time, in other words, if you're jacking one corner too much or the other corner too much, this very expensive windshield here has been known to break. This windshield can shear because of the twisting of the chassis when you're lifting one corner. That can actually create stresses on the windshield and result in a crack. Sometimes the crack comes maybe a week or maybe a month later, but you've created some fatigue in the windshield. So those are little things. When you're doing your own maintenance, you must, absolutely, it's imperative that you do the research up front and you learn what the intricacies are, what the issues can be, and what the tools that you need are. When you're doing, for example, a standard routine thing like charging your battery. If you look at one of my previous videos, it can be very, very expensive mistake by improperly charging or overcharging your battery. You can impose tens of thousands of dollars damage by improperly charging a battery or doing a wrong connection on your battery or electrical system. So it's very, very important that you understand all the little details, even of what seems to be the most mundane task, that you look at every little single detail. If you don't, you can wind up with a huge, huge bill at the end of the day. Another thing too is engine oil. These cars, if you don't follow it by the book, they say the engine oil should be filled up approximately 6 quarts. Now the car itself holds about 12 liters of oil. But they tell you in the manual, for example, when you're firing it up and you're actually, after you drain the oil and done the filter change, you're actually only going to fill it up initially with about 6 liters of oil. You're going to start the car, run it up to temp. There's various reasons for that. I'm not going to get into this video into that detail why, but those are little examples of the procedure and protocol that should be followed when you're doing maintenance, and that's an oil change, a simple task. But if you don't follow those rules, there can be other problems created. Another problem was, and I have actually firsthand experienced this. This happened on a previous car of mine, a Porsche 930. Now, what can actually happen, so if you're in the back, this car is a mid-engine. A 911 is also, well, it's not a mid-engine, it's a rear engine. But they both have transaxles, or they both have rear transmissions, and they have rear drive shafts that come off of that transmission that drive to the rear wheels. Well, those axles are actually mounted to the wheel hub on the outside with a bunch of hexagonal, or they have different types of bolt configurations, but nonetheless, they have a bunch of bolts that bolt that axle onto the hub, and they bolt it on the transmission end. There's 2 sets of basically hubs that bolt up. Well, I've actually seen it where those bolts came loose. You can only imagine what can happen. I had seen it with the previous 911 where the bolts walked out and the axle dropped. The axle actually came off of the transmission and fell and resulted in this case, fortunately, it was just basically the axle fell onto the throttle cable, which then spiked the revs and so on and so forth. You can only imagine. Now, the fortunate part was that happened at a very, very low speed. I was taking off from a red light. So, what do you think can happen to that axle if it drops off the transmission and you're doing 100 kilometers per hour or faster? What do you think that axle is going to do? If you don't crash and lose control, bare minimum, you're going to sustain a lot of undercarriage damage from that axle smacking around under there, breaking parts off by the thousands of dollars. So, again, it's very important when you're doing your own maintenance to understand all the little infinite details. Before you touch it, you really should know what you're up against. So, like I said, at the end of the day, the choice is yours. Whether you do maintenance for yourself on your exotic car, like my Lamborghini for example here, or whether you choose to just sub all that out to a mechanic shop. And both are really both very valid, but you just have to know what your limits are. You have to understand what your limits and your capabilities really are. Do not tackle something that you're not capable of. All you do is wreck something. It costs you more money, and then that in turn sometimes creates that, oh, I hate my car now because I did this, and all these shortcuts. Then you sell it, and that big lump of shit becomes somebody else's problem. So only tackle the maintenance that you know how to tackle. If there's a big problem, for example, a clutch is a pretty big job in this car. If you don't know how to do that, don't do it. Just give it to somebody that knows how to do this. That's my advice. One other thing to consider when you're considering doing your own maintenance versus taking it into a shop. Yes, you can save a lot of money by performing your own maintenance, but consider this. When you go to sell the car and somebody's asking you for all the records and the maintenance records on the car, a supercar with no maintenance records is worth 70% of a car that's well documented. So when you're doing an oil change, if you do it yourself, you want to keep record of basically the oil bills, the charge for all the parts. So when you take your car into the shop, the service records you typically get, those go with the car. That becomes an easier sell, and therefore will get you more of a premium. So the question ultimately becomes, is that maintenance really worth it to do myself? Because ultimately, if you do it yourself and you don't keep the records, because all you're buying is parts at that point in time, is that really worth it to you? Is that worth it in your mind? because the value of your car slightly would be less. Whereas if you take your car to the shop and you have very well outlined detail for records, the history of that car will prove to the new owner what you've done to the car. So I really hope you enjoyed this video, everybody. I just wanted to summarize that, the goods and the bads as to why you would or would not perform your own maintenance on these supercars, in this case my Lamborghini. Please comment, like, subscribe as usual, and I'd love to hear from you. Please tell me what your thoughts are on this, because there's value and everybody has their own thoughts.